All right, this is episode 14 of the Progression Health podcast. I'm here with brianohaonghusa, and he is going to introduce himself now.
Thank you, Ross. It's nice to be on the podcast. Thank you for having me. So my name is brianohaonghusa. I am university qualified nutritionist. So I have a bachelor's of human nutrition. And after I did my undergrad degree, I went and did a couple of nutrition coaching courses, all right, which led me into that field, which is what I wanted to do. Basically from the start of going down the nutrition route from a career perspective, I knew that's essentially where I wanted to end up. Working with people one-to-one, but not in like a dietetics capacity where they were already maybe quite sick, or there's a lot of clinical aspects to it. Right now I am the head of nutrition and Triage Method. So if anyone doesn't know what Triage Method is, it's an online coaching company. So we do online personal training, and we also do online nutrition coaching, which is what I'm looking after. I got a team of, one other fella working with me, Dean, on the nutrition team, but obviously expand that as time goes on. Most of what we do is coaching and education. So there's the Coach's Corner, which is our education platform for professionals. If you're a personal trainer or want to upskill in training side of things and nutrition or whatever else, we have that. So put out a lot of educational content, as I hope you can attest to, Ross. On social media, everything else. So yeah, Triage Method, head of nutrition there, and I do coach a lot. I spend most of my time coaching people, like in all different capacities, like quite a wide range of clients. So between body composition improvement clients, fat loss, or improving healthy eating. If they need to manage a certain health condition like type 2 diabetes or PCOS or IBS, all that sort of stuff. You have athletes and people who just want to maximize their training performance. And then in kind of recent years, I've found myself working with a lot of people with disordered eating habits and behaviors, and things like binge eating or anxieties and being overly rigid and restrictive when it comes to their food and having fears of certain foods and stuff like that. So that overlap of kind of the nutrition science and psychology is where I've been doing a lot of work in the last, say, 2 years, 3 years maybe. And I really, really enjoy that stuff. But I also enjoy having like a wide range of things, like, it keeps things interesting rather than just sticking to the one client.
Brilliant. Yeah, we'll touch on what you've learned on recently later in the podcast. It's funny how I was thinking nutrition, you're kind of like pigeonholed into one area, but as you've just alluded to, there's so many different parts of nutrition. So let's say you got 100 clients coming to you. What are kind of some of the typical, we'll say, challenges that these clients have, or typical things you work on with these clients?
Yeah, I think a lot of the biggest challenges they have is their experience with, I suppose, the dieting industry or the fitness industry, let's call it, and their previous experience with dieting and trying to manage their nutrition, because they're often exposed to like nonsense information, which leads to them having these erroneous beliefs about what they actually need to do to get results with their nutrition. So, it often is less extreme than what they think it needs to be. But then it also often takes longer than they might initially think, because, we don't do quick fixes. We basically want to transform someone's ability to look after their nutrition long term. That's always the goal. When anybody signs up, it's like, okay, I want to get you to the point where I'm the last nutritionist you'll ever need, right? If you choose not to, you could obviously just, people like the accountability, people like to see how other coaches do things, et cetera, but you will have the tools and the skills at least to manage this stuff on your own if you wanted to. There's a huge educational component of getting people's understanding in order of like what the principles are that the boxes they actually need to tick to achieve the goals that they have as it relates to their nutrition, and be it body composition or performance or whatever else. But people often come in with these, like I said, like beliefs that you can't eat certain foods, right, because they're inherently fattening, or even for my kind of disordered eating clients, like beliefs that they can't eat certain foods because they can't control how much they're going to eat of those foods. But often the issue comes back to the actual restriction in the first place. So, often like food is the solution to the problem and not the problem itself. In terms of like athletes, a lot of them, aren't eating enough in some cases. Most people aren't eating enough protein. Like that's nearly all across the board. People aren't eating enough protein. People aren't eating enough plant foods, so vegetables, fruits. People generally aren't eating enough fiber. Their omega-3 intake it can be kind of low because they're not eating oily fish. So if they're not eating oily fish and they're not using an omega-3 supplement, then potentially they're not getting enough marine omega-3 fatty acids into their diet. So those are kind of some like dietary lapses that I would see a lot of. And then like some of the things I described already from like the psychology around the process. So people often have pretty wild expectations of, basically, how fast they're going to get results potentially, but also, like I said, what is actually required to get them. So that would be a lot of it, and it's a lot of it comes down to just having it is genuinely limiting beliefs. Like I know that phrase is thrown around a lot, but it's beliefs that hold them back, and like perfectionism standards. Jesus, that's a huge one. And setting these standards for themselves that they can't reach, and then they feel shit about that, and then they give up because by their own standards they're just failing all the time, even though they might be doing more than enough to get the results. It's like if they've set their target at like 100% and they're only doing 90%, they're still falling short, even though they're 90% of the way. So that's a massive one, man. And then people just genuinely being so hard on themselves, like lacking that self-compassion, because I've been asked before, like, what would I change, like across the board, if I could wave a magic wand or something, whatever you comes in, and it's like, what wave of the wand would I think would have a large impact? And I answered that question before as like, I just wish people weren't as hard as themselves, weren't as hard on themselves, and were a bit more self-compassionate. And then I suppose within that, there's the mindfulness component, and you could tie that into mindful eating. So people are generally, how they eat their food is generally not that helpful for what their goals might be. So they might eat too quickly, and they may be mindless eating, and that may be conducive to more disordered eating behaviors and things like that. So that is a lot of stuff I'm after throwing at you, I realize. But just kind of rattling them off. They're definitely some of the main, I suppose, issues we see for people coming in the door.
Yeah, that gives it a full sweep and perspective of like how much work you can do on your nutrition, and how many different avenues you can go down. So I guess it would be easier if we had a client in front of us, but do you think ways people can improve their nutrition, is it more knowledge, or is it more like kind of, we'll say psychologically, sort of, I don't know how you kind of describe that, maybe like the relationship with food or themselves? Is it like how they look at the food, or just simply their knowledge, or would it be typically a combination of both?
Yeah, it's a good question. Like it's depending on the person. There's definitely elements of both. I could definitely argue from a knowledge perspective, people potentially don't have the knowledge that they need to eat more protein. But it's often a knowledge of implementation. It's like helping people actually problem solve and troubleshoot these issues. So like if I say to you, Ross, like, okay, and we need to get you eating more protein. I need to give you some sort of guidance on how you actually go about that. So having the knowledge to eat more protein is not enough. You need to have the knowledge of how to do that. Because I think for a lot of people, they'll like, if you ask them what a healthy diet looks like, they'll probably be able to give you a good summary of what they're looking for. Like most people will probably say like, oh yeah, if I was to improve my diet, I'd probably want to eat more vegetables and more fruit and stuff. But then at the same time, you do see where people have been led astray by just misinformation in the fitness industry. So it's like, you know, I know I should eat more fruit and vegetables, but not too much fruit because of the, you know, the sugar in that, which is nonsense, right? So there's faults in knowledge, certainly in those kind of contexts. That sugar one comes up a lot. And I suppose, yeah, again, a lack of knowledge in the sense that knowing what principles they have to satisfy to get the results that they want. So like they probably don't have to just cut out like bread or entire food groups like or carbohydrates, you know, to get the results they want. And like thinking that that's the case shows a knowledge deficit, I suppose, of how the process actually works. And I often talk about this where like it's methods and principles. So like going on a low carb diet is a method to which, you know, satisfy the principle of a caloric deficit, which is what's going to generate the fat loss, right? But you don't have to do it that way. And if people don't understand these principles, then they end up in a situation where they think there's some magic to the low carb approach, which is then obviously that's what the people who are, you know, religiously attached to those certain diets will tell you that yes, there is inherent magic to low carb diets, and it's not just about the calories when it is just about the calories. So it can be tough out there, like for people, if depending on where they're getting their information from. And then from a psychological standpoint, like that's certainly the case for a lot of those people with poor relationship with food and disordered eating. That, like I said already, is food is often the solution in that situation rather than the problem. It's often used as like say a coping mechanism, or it serves some sort of purpose. And you know, often that, as you said, can be related back to like relationships with themselves as well, and like not just the food. So that side of things gets pretty complex, as you can imagine, and there can be a lot to unpack. And it's a lot of dialogue, really. It's a lot of back and forth, and just having conversations about this stuff and helping people to challenge their thinking. You know, a lot of kind of cognitive therapy, almost what it looks like, approaches to get people thinking differently about their food. And then you definitely have to implement some amount of knowledge there. So it's like, okay, maybe I'm saying to you like, okay, I think you can actually eat chocolate and not have that be a problem for you in terms of getting your results. But until that person goes and implements that and sees that for themselves, you know, it'll be hard for them to buy into. But that would be like the knowledge provision there, where it's like, okay, well, I'm telling you that, yeah, it's not really about the chocolate. It's more like how much you have and your relationship to eating it in the first place. Because, you know, if you feel terrible after you eat chocolate because you've broken some food rules that you've inherited or drawn up yourself, and then you feel shit about that, and then you use more chocolate to numb the feelings of feeling shit, and it becomes kind of a spiral then. So they're definitely the two of them are interlinked. Like you can't really separate them, but it varies from person to person. Like some people will just, you know, they just need to understand that like, hey, this is the eating pattern that is going to satisfy the requirements to achieve my goals. This is what it looks like. And once they have that knowledge, it's fine. And then go and implement it. But then for other people, it can be more on the psychological front.
Yeah, you can see how many different like mechanisms are at play with simply just having something like a bar of chocolate. Like it can be so complicated. Yeah. So why do you think that we'll call them like bad ideas? Why are they like so pervasive? Like why does the typical person seem to fall prey to so many bad ideas around nutrition and all the stuff you've just talked about, like, you know, the really solid fundamentals of proper nutrition? Why are they not like out there? Because this is something I think about a lot. I'm like, you know, every second client or person I talk to, they're possessed by some idea that just makes no sense when you think about it, really, but they're so common. It's quite bizarre.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and there's obviously many potential reasons for it. I think one of the reasons is like, you know, we're drawn to that shiny object syndrome, and we we like, well, I was going to say simple answers or simple solutions to our problems, but the reality is that it's often the simple solutions that get ignored. And then, for example, somebody whose general activity, their NEAT is low, right? Let's say that's the problem, but for that person, they identify with having a broken metabolism, and that's their issue. So, and that will be, there's definitely information out there, depending on where you look, that people will say, yes, you have a broken metabolism, and that's the cause of your weight problems and things like that, or whatever the case may be. But it's the people who are saying like, yes, this is the answer, it's this broken metabolism. I can help you fix that, when you sign up to my program or you buy my supplements or whatever the hell the person is selling. But I think a lot of people in this industry, especially in the training side of things, or maybe even like more specifically like rehab, injury, pain management, a lot of that is, I think you probably agree, like people create problems and then sell the people solutions to them. Like all the stuff about like posture and shit, that's like that's not really my area of expertise, but like with like Gary on the team and stuff, he's a genius when it comes to that sort of stuff and the movement and the physical side of things. So I think the people who have, well, yeah, so there's a few things I'm trying to unpack here in my head. So the people who are going to promote all the nonsense stuff have very little qualms about promoting their nonsense stuff, right? Because they're fully invested. They're at the far left side of that Dunning-Kruger graph, where they have a little bit of knowledge and they're convinced that that is all there is to know. Whereas people in my position in the nutrition field are, we're constantly just saying like possibly this and maybe that, and it could seem that X, Y, Z. There's very little things that we say conclusively, and there's very few absolute statements that we make, right? Because we understand that there's so much nuance to this, and we understand how little we actually know in the grand scheme of things. So we're a lot more conservative in terms of making bold statements, and if we're not making bold statements, then probably not garnering as much attention, because if someone goes on, like Dave Asprey goes out there and says like putting this butter in your coffee is going to solve all your problems, like that's engaging and that's eye-catching. People are like, oh shit, yeah, butter, I thought that was bad for me. No, but I can put it in my coffee and lose like 50 pounds or whatever and then feel fantastic and like win Silicon Valley, because I'm going to be so mentally supercharged. Like I can't go and say that ethically, like any of that kind of shit, but he can, and he has no qualms about it. So that's very, very attractive, and people like to buy into those kinds of solutions to their problems. The kind of magic pill stuff versus the kind of unsexy stuff that is at the root of it, and that people like myself have to kind of deal in. Like it would be easy to just start making wild claims and get a bigger following that way, but it would be all lies. So I think that's a huge issue, and then the fact that there's no filter and no kind of policing of what people can put out there, right? Because you potentially go onto like the medical mediums page and you start giving him shit for talking about celery juice exorcisms or whatever the fuck he's talking about. You just get blocked. Like there's no engagement, there's no debate there. It's just you're blocked. You're a hater, whatever, and that's it. So there's just, and like, so without any of the filtering, and it doesn't accommodate any policing, you got people just out there able to garner large audiences. That's the stuff that's going to get picked up like in media in general, because again, it's more engaging, rather than, man 29 suggests eating vegetables is good. Like that's not as engaging. So those are some of the reasons, I think. Is there any major ones that you'd add, or do you think along the same lines?
I'm just thinking of like Tony Robbins. Tony Robbins comes to mind with all his stuff and how he's like so kind of eccentric and he makes, crazy claims. And I guess we like novelty, or we like, things that appear sexy or extreme. I guess that gets us excited. And really, it's kind of like if you require excitement to be consistent, you're going to have a tough time being consistent because, the stuff that works, it will not excite you, but it will work. So I guess not a whole, that's just, what I can add, not too specific, but yeah, novelty does have a big role in these things.
Yeah.
It makes me think, I guess, that people who are like sort of charlatans, they're definitely doing something right, whether it's ethical or not. That's a whole other question, but it's like, I think we could definitely learn something from them in the sense that if we could, I don't know, kind of jazz up the work we do, or maybe be aware that the novel approach or the exciting approach, can bring more people over to what we do, more evidence-based approach, instead of just being the kind of the researcher academic in your ivory tower, totally out of touch with the lay people, that'd be the worst situation to be in. But yeah, just kind of going back then to like what you've done more recently, the fat loss phase you had, you were getting coached by Paddy of Triage. Will you just tell us a little bit about that, how you had such a nice kind of result, and then what you're currently doing as well with your post diet kind of nutrition as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started getting coaching from Paddy as soon as the gyms reopened here, which was in around June, start of June. And I for a long time I hadn't had anyone take care of my programming for me, so I hadn't been training with as much intention. Like, I had been training consistently, but then especially throughout like lockdown and stuff was like I don't know how much training from home you might have had to do, but like it's hard to bring the same fire to training in the same space where you're also sitting down watching TV like in the evenings. It was hard to bring the intensity, so it was very much like a maintenance kind of training approach. Not aiming to get like very big or very strong from home, but at least maintaining muscle mass. And where I worked on some different like modalities, like power stuff and things, and more cardio, but it's kind of beside the point. I wanted some sort of focus with my training. So having a coach obviously to program for you based on the goals that you have, and then because it wasn't like I got a nice result. I lost like 10 kilos or so, which I should say was like where I am now is like my normal more than where I started. So that was some weight I had gained throughout the pandemic, I suppose. And it wasn't one of these cases where like, oh, I just like let everything slide and gained weight over the pandemic. I was very happy to see that go up. So I was kind of content with that. And I'd never been that heavy for any consistent period of time. So I was like, all right, this is pretty cool. Like I'm at a kind of PB and sort of body weight and stuff. And like my body composition wasn't bad. I was relatively happy with it. But clothes and things were starting to get, certain clothes starting to get tight. Then we'll have to buy a whole new wardrobe. I needed to lose weight for jiu-jitsu, to get into competitive weight bracket again. And like I said, this is like sort of where I've sat weight-wise, body comp-wise for the last 10 years or so. So I'm back in my range, so to speak. But we had a lot of things I wanted to work on. I had some kind of ongoing knee issues that I had because I used to play a lot of basketball, and I wanted to go back to playing basketball, which I have done. So managing that knee pain, what was a big part of it that Paddy helped me with. Getting fitter, stronger for jiu-jitsu mostly, and the cardiovascular fitness as well for basketball, and get my resting heart rate down because it was a little high, like for somebody who considers themselves to be pretty fit and healthy. Like it was a little bit high, so driving that down was good. Saw a big increase in my testosterone levels as well, which not necessarily something we're aiming for as such, but it's nice to see that. Which is probably mostly driven by the big influx in training intensity. It's really going after those sessions. and losing that body fat as well. That was like people keep asking me like, oh my God, how'd you increase your T levels by so much? Because they went from like 19, 20 nanomoles per liter up to like 28 or 29 or something like that. And then 31 is like the high end of normal. So I'm right at the high end of normal now. So people obviously think that's cool, like when you see such a big shift over the course of a few months. That's what we did. Yeah, is, the Paddy was taking care of all my programming. I was taking care of my nutrition, the accountability, and having to fill in the check-ins like counts for a lot, because I keep saying that even if Paddy was not going to give me any feedback throughout the whole process, just by me having to fill in the check-in and kind of objectively review the week each week was massively beneficial. Obviously having a training program to follow, having, I won't say certain numbers to hit, because like we use a lot of auto regulations like reps in reserve or rate of perceived exertion. So having training intensities to hit, let's say, because the actual weights could fluctuate based on, how well you slept, how far into the diet you were, etc. So yeah, that was the crack. Like, it was mostly fat loss, get fitter, get stronger. Kind of trying to do everything, to be fair, when I actually say it all out loud. And then we wrapped it up when it was starting to get difficult in terms of how I was feeling. Yeah, I wasn't feeling too great towards the end. Adherence as a result was starting to slip. I could have lost like another kilo potentially, and that would have been brought us to like exactly where we wanted to be, but didn't really need to invest the more time and effort into doing that when I could just wrap it up at that point. So now I'm like 4 or 5 weeks into a maintenance phase, like, so since the fat loss phase. And the idea here is to, obviously it was a big injection of calories, so brought calories up by about 20% from where I finished in the dieting phase. So, that was a reasonably big jump. I have not seen any regression in body composition as a result, which I think it's good for people to hear that, because one of the problems I see with a lot of people is that like they don't know what to do after a fat loss phase. Like, assuming they do a successful fat loss phase, which can be difficult in its own right, but once they achieve the fat loss goals, they don't really know what to do next, because they obviously don't want to regress. They don't want to just gain all the weight back that they lost. So then they're not sure what to do, and then it can be kind of a tough proposition to say, okay, well, you need to start eating more, start going back to maintenance calories rather than being in a deficit. But it does work. So, basically a good message from this is that the approach that got you to where you wanted to be is not necessarily what's going to have to keep you there. So it is pertinent to start eating more, start just having more energy in the system again, because a lot of that stuff was shot for me towards the end. Like, energy levels weren't that good, training intensity, like we did a thing with 4 months of a diet phase. Training intensity for the first 3 months was phenomenal, like it was class. And the last month, and it was dog shit. Like it was really, really, I was dragging myself through sessions. So I was doing a lot of training. And, I could see my steps declining, not intentionally, but whereas previously I would happily go out for like 15 minutes and just shoot around a basketball. I was not doing that whatsoever towards the end. So it was interesting for me to see that stuff kind of objectively, like, oh yeah, I can see how my NEAT is declining here, and I literally just don't feel like doing that versus where I would before. Libido wasn't great by the end either. So that was, all those reasons were like why it was time to wrap it up. And now things are a lot better. Having spent a few weeks at maintenance and eating a lot more, and trying to manage training fatigue. I'm doing a lot of training, so it's important to try and manage essentially fatigue across the week, like to keep everything ticking along properly. So does that answer your question? Anything else you want to know about that? That's the gist.
That's great. Yeah, that just shows you how much you can do with good support and a good coach. Something I want to go back to is, you said you gained weight, but you felt pretty happy about it. And I know that's a big fear for people. I'd even say myself, if I was to do a book, I would be like, or a mass gaining phase, whatever you want to call it, I would be kind of apprehensive about the idea of like, oh, I lose my abs, I lose my definition, or whatever. But it's like, I guess, did you do anything intentionally to make that easier for yourself?
I think, and that's something that a lot of people struggle with, is that prospect of losing definition or seeing a deterioration in body composition. The way I would look at it, and the way I encourage people to look at it, is that what are you actually trading in for? Let's call it a deterioration body composition. What are you actually gaining from that, though? So you're able to obviously eat more, and that's what you're doing. So what does that yield? That yields kind of more flexibility just in managing your nutrition overall. It yields more flexibility in social situations, going out for meals with your partner or friends or family or whoever. A little bit less of a mental burden in terms of managing your nutrition, right? So there may be an added mental effect from trying to come to terms with the fact you're gaining weight, but there's also a bit of a relief where you can afford to be a bit more relaxed with your nutrition, and your lifestyle and all the things that come with that. So again, energy levels going to be pretty good. Generally not feeling hungry. Your training performance should be pretty good. Now, I will say that doing a gaining phase during a lockdown is not ideal. Like, it's not the smartest thing to do, because I would have probably got a lot more out of it being in a surplus when the gyms are open and I was able to train as normal, right? I had a decent home training setup, fair enough. Like, I think upper body training was pretty solid. Lower body was a bit more difficult to manage, but basically looking at all the things that you gain besides the weight, right? That's basically what we're looking at, besides the body fat. And then, understanding where this fits in to, the process that you're in, or the path that you're on, that, like, yes, maybe you'll gain some weight here, but, you can probably pull it off, pretty easily. You can run a fat loss phase if you wanted to. And like, I'm going to say, for me, myself, but also this is something I try to preach to people, is like, how important is it to you what you look like and why? So we have a saying, in triage, that, like, what your body physically looks like should be one of the least interesting things about you as a person. So what else factors into your sense of self-esteem, I suppose? What are the things that you value, that you're taken care of in life, that aren't just your physical appearance? Because if all you've got is your physical appearance, like, that's not much really to go on as a full-fledged human being. And if you look at people, you may have seen these kind of images before, either from like Shannon, or if you ever look at Jake Leonard and stuff, the break binge eating, the pie chart of how someone's, like, the proportions of the things that people are doing in their life. So maybe like their career, their exercise, their spirituality, their family, their friends, those relationships, and then their physical appearance. Like, what size of the pie does each of those things take up? Have you seen this, or do you know what I'm talking about? Or
No, but it sounds kind of like a little bit intuitive. I can imagine it.
Yeah, sweet. Yeah, good. I think hopefully everyone else can imagine it then as well. So what you see is that for people who generally have disordered eating behaviors, like, that often stems from an overemphasis on how much of that pie is taken up by physical appearance. So, for me, for example, physical appearance, I'll just say like 20% of the pie. But then for someone who has issues with themselves, essentially, and disordered eating behaviors, this is often driven by this overemphasis of overvaluation is the better word for it. Overvaluation of weight and physical appearance in that pie chart. So theirs could be like 40% or something, that pie chart. So that means that everything else that could potentially bring you kind of fulfillment in your life doesn't get as much attention. So trying to make it a bit more even is a great way to basically not have all your eggs in the what I look like basket in terms of you feeling good about yourself. So my point from that is that trying to cultivate other things aside from what you look like that can be important to you. So again, relationships, like my career is very important to me. That takes up a big chunk of my pie, and being a good coach. So I say I could look like shit, but if I'm doing a pretty good job of that, I'm probably still going to be pretty content. Now I'm still not going to be willing to just let myself go. It shouldn't be the case, I don't think, for myself, because I enjoy doing all the things that will keep me, physically healthy and fit or whatever. One aspect of this that I should point out is, as well, that made it easier, is that my pattern of fat deposition is favorable for body composition. So I store a lot of fat in my glutes. So for some people, the typical male fat deposition pattern is around the spare tire midsection. So for someone who doesn't have the same sort of pattern as I do, I've that Instagram fit chick storing loads of fat in my glutes for the booty poses, which is kind of fortunate because it means my midsection doesn't pack on a lot of fat. So visually, I could be a lot heavier, but you might not notice because a lot of it is in my glutes. So that's just a kind of, I won't say weird, but just an aside that's worth mentioning, because that definitely makes it easier, because I'm not getting a gut, so to speak, at the same rate as someone else might if they didn't have that pattern of fat deposition. You know what I mean? So I think it would be remiss of me not to say that that also helps, because aesthetically maybe it's not the same detriment as for someone else, right? Makes sense.
Yeah, that's a great answer. That really gives a broad overview of how people should approach a weight gain phase if they so wish to do so, or if they're thinking about it. To kind of pivot and go towards the end of your fat loss phase. So I think a lot of people they see Men's Fitness and Rob Riches or whoever, Steve Cook is a 10-pack, and oh, I'd love to have that. That'd be great. My life would be so much better. And then it's kind of you're talking about how difficult it was to reach your target. So will you just talk a little bit about let's say when training was going well, nutrition was going well, all the other facets of your life were going well, and then that last month, kind of compare and contrast a little bit, would you?
Yeah. So I will say as well that like I said, I am at a point where my body is pretty happy. This is where I'm normally at. So I'm normally in this it's getting a little bit heavier as years go on, hopefully because I'm building more muscle tissue. But between that 84, 88 kilo range is where I am historically. And I started that diet phase back in say June when I started working with Paddy, at 96, 97 kilos, right? So it's 10 kilos over kind of the high end of my normal. So I don't think I'd have any problem going lower, but it would have been very difficult because I've been as light as say 80, 82 kilos. When I actually started gaining all that weight, I just finished up a month in Bali back in the end of 2019, and I just lost weight there. I was struggling to eat enough food. I got sick a couple of times, a couple of days not eating then in that case. So that was where the weight gain started, was at my lowest generally point in terms of body weight. And then over the course of 18 months or something, I gained the weight and then obviously pulled it off again. But it would have been very difficult for me to go from 96 back down to 80 versus going from 96 to 86. Now I'm gonna hang out here for a while, keep pushing calories up a little bit, keep enjoying training again, and trying to get stronger and having goals set in that context. So I think that's another important part of managing a gaining phase. You should have goals and targets to work towards, and then that will go pretty well. But to actually answer your question, the difference was motivation to train was a lot lower. I wouldn't say I was overly hungrier, but sorry, I wouldn't say that the hunger was unmanageable, but the low energy was an issue for me. Especially when I'm trying to work and stuff and do well at that. So even from not a training point of view. So that was a bit of a, I think that was encouraging me to eat more. So I might not have been necessarily very hungry, but I was eating more, and therefore my adherence was slipping a little bit. So I was eating a couple hundred calories more maybe some weeks than I should have been, which is a good sign of maybe when to call it quits, because if your adherence is not good, you have to tweak something. And for me in that case, the tweak was just to finish up the diet phase. But yeah, low energy, poor libido, low training drive. Those were the main ones, the main deficits, I would say, that I wanted to address, I suppose, because I was really enjoying training sessions, right? And then all of a sudden I wasn't. I was having to drag myself to the gym to do those training sessions, having to drag myself to jiu-jitsu to do those training sessions. I'm not that eager to do my cardio. Yeah, and then obviously no one enjoys low libido, least of all my girlfriend. So, that was, there was no reason for me to just stick it out. I like feeling good, for as much of the time as I can, and there was no necessity for me to just stay there for another few weeks to try and take off another kilo, because what was that gonna mean for me? Nothing. It was going to bring me slightly closer or in a slightly better position for competing in jiu-jitsu. But then it actually turned out, I didn't mention this, but it occurred to me that I had intentions to compete, but then when I looked at the competition schedule, I saw, well, shit, I'm actually missing most of the competitions this year because I'm going to be away. I'm going away on Saturday, and most of the comps are going to be this month and next month. So it was okay, well, that actually takes away another reason for me to actually need to finish this off and to specifically be at that weight. So yeah, those were the main contrasts. Basically looking forward to training every week or every day, I should say, versus not, and it being a bit of a slog. And you still can go and do it. That's I suppose it's a good point. I wasn't missing sessions, but I don't think I missed a session in the first 3 months at all. Which is pretty, we talk about consistency all the time. That's legitimate consistency. And then I did miss some in the last month, not really, just not because I just wasn't going to them or anything, but just different things came up that hadn't come up before that got in the way or whatever. But yeah, they were the main differences, I would say.
Those are huge as well, because that's your quality of life, your libido, your motivation to work out, which is if you're working a lot and you're building up your career, working out is it's almost like your self-care and just something you do for enjoyment. So it's one less thing you're going to enjoy. The food and energy as well, you can't really have the zest for life that you normally have. So, it might look great on the cover, but there's a lot going on, behind the scenes that, you could be missing out on. So it's important to consider that when you set out in the fat loss phase.
Yeah. The cost of getting lean. Yeah, literally.
Yeah, there's a huge cost, and sustainability is kind of something you're touching on there. It's pretty much not really sustainable to have a lean physique year round, and nor would you want to for all the reasons you've alluded to. So one of your posts you had was about self-compassion, and you have a 3-part series on that. Will you touch on that and touch on why you did a series on it and why it's important?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned it earlier. How people are so hard on themselves. So self-compassion, where you are not being really hard on yourself. There's 3 main components to self-compassion. Hence why it's a 3-part series on it. So it's a way of treating yourself essentially. So I think we all can conceptualize what it means to be compassionate in general, and then it's just that we're probably good at being compassionate with other people, but maybe less so with ourselves. Which is a shame. So there's the first element of is the common humanity piece, right? So, essentially, if you're ever struggling with something, this is where the self-talk can creep in, and you can either tell yourself that like you're a terrible person because you're struggling with this, and the stadia, how can you not like just get this done, or whatever it is. So that's obviously the uncompassionate approach. But then an element of the more compassionate approach is that you acknowledge that you are not the only one going through whatever this problem is. You're not the only one having this struggle. Essentially, someone somewhere is either going through it right now as well, same as you, or at least has done in the past, in history, right? I read a lot of like Stoic philosophy and stuff, and it's, some of that stuff is over like a couple thousand years old, and it's the same. They're having the same problems that we are now, like obviously in a different kind of format and different environment, but same problems. So like human problems are as old as we are, essentially. So someone somewhere is having those problems that you're having. Someone somewhere will have them in the future, right? So that's helpful for us to acknowledge that we're not alone, and we're not like a freak or a weirdo or someone that's like isolated in this kind of suffering. That definitely helps people, feel better about what they're going through, and therefore be able to manage it better. So that's one key component of self-compassion. The second one is the mindfulness and being able to be present with what's going on, without judgment. So again, not like berating yourself for having the experience that you're having, just having the experience, and that's it. So that can kind of quieten, the mental chatter, which again, depending on how you talk to yourself, can make things worse. And then third component of self-compassion is self-kindness. So like literally just as it sounds, being nice to yourself. The really good frame that I like to use for this is, if you talk to yourself, or would you talk to your friends like you talk to yourself? And if so, would they be your friends for very long if you did? Right. So that's a really good kind of frame of reference. Like, would I actually speak to the people I care about like this? And if the answer is no, then you have to say, okay, well, there's a deficit there, and there's a discrepancy there, because I should be talking to myself like someone I care about. And that's like kind of an interesting concept in this whole sort of coaching process on the psychological side, is that like, if people aren't as hard on themselves, they're often worried that they won't bother with the things that they need to do, and they'll become lazy, essentially. But the reality is that you will probably take care of the things that you care about and that you like. So if you actually care for yourself, by not berating yourself all the time and so on and so forth, it's actually more likely that you'll engage in, health promoting behaviors, because you actually care about yourself now more. Does that make sense? That's an interesting aspect of it. So yeah, that self-kindness is important. And, it's not a cop out. Like people hear it initially and they think, oh yeah, but then I'll just like get lazy and just, eat ice cream all the time because, oh, I can just be compassionate and not like berate myself if I do that, chastise myself if I go amiss. And it's like, well, again, you wouldn't want that for someone that you care about. You wouldn't tell your friend like, oh yeah, no, don't worry about your, fat loss goal, just keep eating the ice cream. Like if you're a real friend, you wouldn't do that. So the same applies to yourself, that if you're actually going to treat yourself properly, it's like, well, you understand what your values are and what your goals are. You're going to do things in support of those. So it's not just going to be like, you're going to take the piss just because you're being a little bit nicer to yourself. And then the research shows that you're more likely to actually have long-term success and achieve those goals when you approach them in this way. So the kind of, the self-flagellation and motivation through fear and things like that doesn't work long-term.
Yeah, which is very counter to what you'd hear in society or how people treat themselves. So I guess you hear the word self-compassion a lot more in recent times, but it's hard to kind of like imagine what it looks like. Do you have any examples of maybe in your work with clients or in your own life where a client has learned to be more self-compassionate, or you have yourself, and it's like kind of, change the course of how a situation was going. And then could you just speak on maybe like, is there one part of the three that's like maybe the most important, or that people should, work on more than others?
Yeah. Where I see this working a lot is that when people are a little bit nicer to themselves as they're going through the process, it actually helps them stick with it long enough so they can see the actual returns from the consistency. Because what I often see is that if people are, this is not necessarily what I see, but like, this is what may have happened before if people are doing this stuff by themselves. Like what you often hear of from people when they start is that like, I can't keep it going. Like I give up after, whatever amount of time. And one of the biggest reasons for that is that because they're so hard on themselves going through the process, they essentially don't want to experience that self-flagellation, over and over and over again, because they're not meeting these like expectations or targets that they've set for themselves, which are, like I said earlier, are often completely out of whack anyway. But what you see with the self-compassion stuff, where people are a bit nicer to themselves, that they can acknowledge basically when they have a week that's good enough to get them the result and keep them on the path that they need to be on, even if it's not perfect. Doesn't matter if it's perfect or not. So it helps them to keep going and not throw in the towel where they might have numerous times in the past, if that makes sense. That's definitely one of the biggest ways that I see self-compassion working in practice. That's like, and this is what people always say, it's like, I in the past I would have thrown in the towel by now. And it's often people who have very negative self-talk generally too. So in terms of the most important of the three, like mindfulness has so many implications in the work that we do. So I do a lot of mindful eating work with people. The people who have like disordered eating issues often need to do some mindfulness and work on being present rather than trying to block out the present with food, and using it as a numbing mechanism. A meditation or mindfulness practice is often very good for a lot of reasons. Let's throw it under mental health, but like there's physical health there as well. So like I'd be tempted to say the mindfulness is, because it's so broad and has so many benefits to it, like all across the coaching experience. But I also spend a lot of time talking to people about their self-talk as well. And, like I said earlier, like asking them to reevaluate it. If it's not something that they would say to a friend of theirs, or, say their best friend, can they rephrase how they're talking to themselves? And then you could say that, like, in order to be able to do that, like you might have to keep like a thoughts diary or a self-talk diary to notice how you speak to yourself. And in order to be able to notice how you speak to yourself, you're going to have to be more mindful and self-aware. So maybe it does always just come back to mindfulness potentially. But yeah, those are some of the ways that we see it go down in the actual coaching.
Yeah, very interesting. It makes me think of like the 10,000 hour rule, and how, it's just really kind of time on task that separates people who kind of maybe master a certain like goal or a certain career. Not really that they had any special ability starting out, and like, they were born with the genetics like LeBron James, or like, I don't know, Henry Shefflin or something, whatever, it's like, no, they just, I guess we're fortunate enough maybe to have the self-compassion to stay on task, like you said, which is like quite interesting to consider. Like, everybody can increase that self-compassion if they become aware of it through the mindfulness. So it's kind of like an empowering message, really. So then the next thing I wanted to touch on is we're coming up to the holidays, Thanksgiving here in the US, the Christmas period back in Ireland, back home. Any kind of, we'll say, tips, strategies, anything you recommend to clients or you do yourself that help people to, I guess the number one thing, really, forget like, flourishing with your health, just not be stressed out over that time. I think it's pretty easy to get stressed out, especially when it comes to nutrition, your area of expertise. So any kind of thoughts around that?
Yeah, so people often feel, as you said, stressed out because this perceived loss of control in relation to their food behaviors. And there's potentially a lot going on. So maybe people have the potential to be eating and drinking more, and then also maybe even exercising less than usual, right? So it's kind of a disruption to their whatever their normal routine may be. But since I mentioned mindfulness there a second ago, it makes me think of like mindful eating principles, right? Which is huge and extremely useful in these situations and in general, right? So like mindful eating is fantastic, but in particular when you've less control over maybe the food that's put in front of you. So maybe you're out at a restaurant, or you're over in friend or family's house, and they prepared the meal, so, or say a Thanksgiving dinner, potentially if you're going somewhere for that, you may not have full control over what food is presented to you or what food is put on your plate, but you do have control over how much you decide to eat. And you can use sort of internal cues of, say, like fullness to help you know when to stop in any of these eating situations. So you can apply this to any time you're eating, right? For any meal. But I find it particularly useful in these sort of contexts. So basically the idea would be that, you sit down to the meal, you're going to eat it really slowly. You're going to take at least 15 minutes to eat it, maybe longer. And while you're going through the eating, you're going to, like I said, take it nice and slow. So you take a mouthful of food, put your knife and fork down in between bites, chew it properly. That will help you slow down. Then, just work your way through it. And like every so often say like, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 out of 10 being, properly stuffed, uncomfortably full, how full do I actually feel right now? And if you have any sort of targets to like manage your body composition, manage weight, either fat loss or maybe just preventing, weight gain with maybe the excess calories that come with this period, stopping at around 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10. So you're pretty content. You could eat more, if you had a mind to, but you're pretty content, and that's a good place to leave it. And like you can apply, what I like of it is you can apply that in any eating situation ever. All you have to do is have a little bit of self-awareness as you're going through the meal. And look, I will say, like, if someone's never practiced this before, because most people eat really quick, like I said earlier, like they eat quickly and mindlessly, without much consideration of how full they are. So if you're new to this, you're not going to be like really well attuned to what 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10 feels like at the first time you try it. Okay, so it's a skill that takes a bit of practice, like everything else. But going ahead with that and just letting that be some of the guiding principles at your meals, even if you're not thinking too much about what you're eating, which you absolutely can. Like, you can do all the usual stuff of, prioritizing your protein sources and prioritizing your plant sources and then building your meals around that. But even if you can't do that for whatever reason, you can still use these mindful eating principles. And it's kind of hard to go wrong, if you actually maintain some level of mindful eating self-awareness, because if you do, then you won't, just sit on the sofa and with like a box of celebrations or something and just keep eating them, because, if you were to do that, it wouldn't be very mindful. So like trying to control the food environment in that sense is smart as well. So like, don't sit on the couch with the tub of celebration on your lap. Instead, put a few out into a bowl or something and have that, and then, put the rest away where you can't see them. Don't make it harder for yourself by massively increasing the levels of temptation, because it's way easier to just keep eating them in that context than it is to stop. Whereas if they're back out in the press and you have to go up and get them, that's a little bit harder to do than if they're just on your lap all the time. So besides the like very typical stuff, like that would be some of the suggestions I have. And there's other things you could look at there. You could look at like utilizing some intermittent fasting, so if you have to account for a lot of higher calorie meals, dinners potentially, then, maybe you skip breakfast and have a normal lunch and then have a normal afternoon snack and then have your dinner or whatever it is. So can be one way to manage, calorie intake across the day or across the week. But I think the mindful eating piece is going to be really helpful, like on a broader scale for people.
That's great. Yeah. So why do you think that people, they kind of like would eat maybe past the point of fullness and wouldn't apply these tools you're talking about, like, as in, and what are the kind of the side effects to that? Like, let's say someone is like, oh, Brian, this sounds great, but like, I really enjoy my food, and I'm gonna sit with the tub of celebrations on my lap. I guess, what are some of like the things you would caution people around, if there are any, or well, yeah, what are your thoughts around that if they didn't apply these tools and they were like, I don't need any plan, I'm going to fly by the seat of my pants, and whatever happens, happens.
There's a huge irony to this, because if you actually eat your food mindfully, you'll enjoy it more because you're actually experiencing it more. So I utilize some kind of intensive mindful eating exercises with people quite a lot for their so-called problem foods, which are the ones they feel like they don't have good control over. So it's like, it's the typical situation. It's like where, oh, I can't just have one biscuit because then I end up having 6 or the whole pack. It's these kind of scenarios. But when I get them to do this mindful eating exercise, one of 2 things happen, right? Either they enjoy the food a lot more, but eat a lot less, usually, to get the same level of satisfaction. Because, one way I often analogize this is if you're sitting on the couch with the tub of celebrations and you're watching TV while you're eating them, because you're probably not sitting on the couch just eating them, right? Who's doing that? If your mind is 50% on the food and 50% on the TV, do you have to eat twice as much to get the same level of satisfaction, right? Because your attention is divided. Whereas if your attention is not divided and you're actually paying attention to the eating experience and being mindful with it, like I said, what you'll often see is people derive a lot more satisfaction from it and end up eating a lot less. And that's the report I nearly always get from people in this situation, is that, wow, I really enjoyed eating that, and I was super satisfied after, whatever it is, half their usual portion, a third of their usual portion. So often that's what happens. Or the other thing that often happens, which people kind of give out to me about when it happens, is that they realize the food they're eating, they actually don't enjoy it. And they're like, the actual eating experience of that was not that nice. So I've had all sorts of great reports and feedback from people, being really good with the descriptive nature of these eating experiences. So I've had a girl, I can just think of some examples off the top of my head, but a girl saying to me that, like, eating these like chocolate covered biscuits, and when doing it mindfully, she realized that she liked the chocolate part, not so much the biscuit part. So it's really just eating them for like the 15% of them, which was the kind of chocolate coating, and then the rest was kind of surplus to her enjoyment. I've had a guy talk about eating crisps in this fashion, and how he realized that he would eat them really quickly to try and maintain the actual flavor of the crisps, because if he actually took his time with it, it just become like a flavorless potato mush in his mouth that wasn't actually that pleasant. So I've had quite a few people ruin foods on themselves where they realize this actually wasn't that enjoyable. Why the hell have I been getting so worked up about, like, being able to control myself when eating this, but also like just wasting time and calories and shit eating this food in the past. And it's like, if you're saying to me, oh, I love my food and I just want to like fly by the seat of my pants, like, you're not doing it. You're not really loving your food because you're not paying attention to it. And if you do pay attention to it, you might be surprised as to what you experience. Like I said, it's usually either, God, why was I eating that like my whole life? Or, yeah, that's class. And yeah, wow, that half a bar of chocolate was super enjoyable. And I don't actually have to eat, 3 bars or whatever to get the same level of satisfaction. So it's to add some more to that, sorry, because you asked, like, what are the downsides to not eating mindfully? But so I've hopefully alluded to there, like, overconsumption is usually the main downside, because if you eat really quickly, you don't have time to register your level of fullness. So if you come home and you're quite hungry and you wolf down your dinner in like 5 minutes or whatever, which is not uncommon, you won't be satisfied at that point because you haven't given enough time for that to happen. So then you'll probably eat something else because you're like, oh, I'm still hungry here, or now I have a sweet craving, because my body hasn't registered that we're after eating a meal. So now I'm going to eat more. And then when you actually get around to that 15, 20-minute mark, you start to realize, oh, I'm actually very full now. Because now it's actually starting to catch up with you, and all the extra that you ate to try and fill the gap just because you didn't give it enough time. So yeah, those are the main reasons. Like it usually leads to overconsumption and less enjoyment of food because you're not actually paying attention to it if you eat too quickly and mindlessly.
Yeah, and then I can imagine as well, it could be like bloating or just discomfort if you're eating too much, which is typically what happens. So really, you could have like a nice meal, especially Christmas, what could be a nice meal on the surface, you could end up spoiling it or having a nice moment with your significant other or friend or whoever. And if you're not mindful, then you kind of ruin, the opportunity is there. So just something then that I notice you do is the jiu-jitsu. So I see it's like getting very popular. And I'm just kind of curious, why is there a trend among like the fitness industry to pick up jiu-jitsu, or is it like a kind of a general thing? It's not just fitness industry folk, we'll call them. And what are then some of the like, the benefits or some of the lessons you've picked up since you've started jiu-jitsu?
Yeah, I like that question. In terms of its rise in popularity, I have to imagine some of that is down to the rise in popularity of like MMA and UFC. Maybe we have, Conor McGregor to thank for that to some extent, despite his, character. He did put it in the spotlight, no doubt about that. And he's done a lot for the sport. So, obviously if you're into MMA or you're more aware of MMA, then naturally thinking about, okay, well, jiu-jitsu is like half of that game. So, or not jiu-jitsu, it's like grappling is half of that. If you're not standing and exchanging strikes, then you're probably grappling to some extent. So I think that definitely has a big role to play. Then in terms of people, I don't know if it's just people in the fitness industry, but I would imagine that people are into training physical activity, are going to be more inclined to say, oh, yeah, maybe I'd like to try that out. I think it may happen as well where, people may have played sports like, early on in life, and then maybe got into the gym, and then maybe it was only the gym that they were doing, and maybe they miss the extra bits that come with it. So maybe like the competition, or sometimes just more fun to have something that's like, more skills based, and there's a little bit more to it, for lack of a better phrase, than just lifting weights up and down. Because I still love lifting weights. Like, I'm not gonna lie, I'm lifting weights like 14, 15 years, whatever. 14 years, 13 years, something like that, over a decade anyway. And I still really enjoy it, but I know some people get kind of sick of it and kind of fall out of love with it, and then they're looking for something to replace that. So, okay, something like jiu-jitsu, maybe it's a bit more challenging. It's not as straightforward as just lifting weights up and down, and there's a lot more to it. There's a lot more to it cognitively, because you're kind of having a chess match as well at the same time. So they're probably some of the reasons I think that it's grown in popularity. And then, obviously, as soon as a few people start doing it, then other people see, oh, hey, I might give that a shot, which is nice. Like, it's nice to see it getting so popular. I've been doing it since 2019, start of 2019. So, like, obviously lost a lot of quality training time during the pandemic when the gyms were closed. So, while it has been a couple of years, like, it hasn't been a couple of years of quality training really. It's getting there, I suppose. It's nearly back up to that at this stage. But a lot of the reasons, like, I love it, and I suppose some of the lessons you can probably take from it and bring them into your life, is that it's, you have to put in a lot to get a little out of it. So if you're somebody who, like, if your ego requires that you go in and progress at something really fast, like, you're probably going to have a tough time doing jiu-jitsu, because as a friend of mine said to me, like, when I was early days doing it, it's like for a long time, you're going to be a nail and everyone else is a hammer, right? So it cultivates a lot of resilience, because well, you literally have to be in very uncomfortable positions, in jiu-jitsu, right? Like you're getting suffocated and people are trying to choke you out. You're struggling to breathe. It can get kind of claustrophobic. So, if you're undergoing that kind of thing on a regular basis, like how much more resilient are you going to be to minor stuff in your just day-to-day life? I think you're going to be a lot more resilient to it. You kind of learn the value of hard work, and just like sticking to the path, because like I said, you have to put in a lot to get a little out of it. And I love that aspect of it. I love the fact that, okay, if I want to get a black belt, I'm going to have to invest like 10 years here. And, it's only from grafting that I'm going to get that. Like I can't, buy my way to a black belt or something. Now that's debatable. There are some online programs that are somewhat questionable in the jiu-jitsu community, because you can get like graded up and stuff without actually ever having to spar with anybody. Like you can just do it all online, which is a bit weird. I don't know much about it, but I've heard that talked about in the club before. So the fact that like if you want to get a black belt, it's like, okay, you're gonna have to put like 10 good years in. I kind of relish that as an opportunity. Whereas some people will say like, fuck it, like the hell with this. I'm not progressing fast enough. A lot of people disappear once they get their blue belt, for some reason, because I think blue is the one that people usually are at the longest before getting ranked up again. And a lot of this can be down to like life circumstances and stuff. But I think like for a lot of white belts, like, if you make it past the first few months and stick with it, then you're like, okay, kind of gunning for a blue belt. And then maybe once you get that, you kind of rest on your laurels a little bit. Or the idea of having to be bottom of the food chain again now, and like only in competition settings, but like in the club, you're just going to be wherever you're at. You're going to be a little bit higher, but there's still going to be a lot of people in there that are going to smash you. So yeah, I just enjoy that, the fact that it's hard work, to be honest. And obviously, I like the kind of cognitive aspect of it. Trying to outthink your opponent. Obviously, the physical aspect of it, I like the self-defense capacity that it provides you, to be able to handle yourself, and to some extent, it's good to have some sort of training in martial arts, I think. So yeah, there are a lot of things that I like about it. I don't really use it as like a physical fitness thing or physical development. It's more like gaining the skills, gaining the knowledge, getting the progression of it, that I think is part of the enjoyment of it. And like, assuming your club is of a good standard, like you only get what you earn. So it's like there's no kind of hiding from it. It's like you're either good enough to get, ranked up or whatever it is, or you're not. And there's no like there's no debate.
Yeah, it's an objective result for the work you're putting in. Sounds like very useful as a life skill. The resiliency and the kind of the discipline I'd imagine you'd learn from it. So that's great. I'm kind of intrigued by like the community aspect of it as well, and just learning self-defense for myself. So maybe in time I'll get around to actually, instead of talking about it, inquiring about it, I'll get to it. But yeah, Brian, this has been brilliant. Thanks very much for your time. Is there anything you want to mention? Anything we didn't go over? Anything you want to discuss?
No, I think I suppose just remind people if where they can find out more about me and triage and stuff, if they've liked the sound of any of this conversation. So you can find me on Instagram at brianohaonghusa. The Triage Method Instagram. All the coaches have their own pages too, so you can find that through the Triage page, because we're the only people that the Triage page is following. So it's just the 6 of us there. And you go to triagemethod.com if you're interested in any of those online coaching, nutrition coaching, personal training services, or any of the educational services that we provide because they're all top class. Like, so I think that's all I want to say. Thank you for having me on, Ross. It was a nice chat. I enjoyed it. So hopefully the listeners will enjoy it as well.
Yeah, it's been brilliant. And I can attest to the quality of the content Triage has. It's great and a great resource for anyone looking to learn more or just trying to educate themselves as well. So this has been great, Brian. Thanks very much.